Hello, and welcome back to Tales from the Old Ones. Tonight, we will be continuing down the dark path that is Herbert's research, as he makes more progress with his solutions, and makes many, many more problems for himself. If this is your first Herbert West part, then I implore you to watch the first two parts and catch you up to speed. Links will be in the description. But, without further ado, I do need to give a quick disclaimer, and then we can begin. Herbert West Reanimator does contain language that is offensive and correlates with outdated societal views. Due to the nature of these words, they have been changed with appropriate words or have been omitted altogether. Thank you for understanding, and I hope you enjoy tonight's tale. It is uncommon to fire all 6 shots of a revolver with great suddenness when 1 would probably be sufficient, but many things in the life of Herbert West were uncommon. It is, for instance, not even that a young physician leaving college is obliged to conceal the principles which guide his selection of a home and office. Yet, that was the case with Herbert West. When he and I obtained our degrees at the medical school of Miskatonic University and sought to relive our poverty by setting up as general practitioners, we took great care not to say that we chose our house because it was fairly well isolated and as near as possible to the potter's field. Reticence such as this is seldom without a cause, nor indeed was ours, for our requirements were those resulting from a life work distinctly unpopular. Outwardly, we were doctors only, but beneath the surface were aims of far greater and more terrible moment, for the essence of Herbert West's existence was a quest amid black and forbidden realms of the unknown, in which we hoped to uncover the secret of life and restore to perpetual animation the graveyard's cold clay. Such a quest demands strange materials, among them fresh human bodies, and in order to keep supplied with these indispensable things, one must live quietly and not far from a place of informal internment. West and I had met in college, and I had been the only one to sympathize with his hideous experiments. Gradually, I had come to be his inseparable assistant, and now that we were out of college, we had to keep together. It was not easy to find a good opening for 2 doctors in company, but finally the influence of the university secured us a practice in Bolton, a factory town near Arkham, the seat of the college. The Bolton Wurst Mills were the largest in the Miskatonic Valley, and their polyglot employees were never popular as patients with the local physicians. We chose our house with the greatest care, seizing at last on a rather run-down cottage near the end of Pond Street, 5 numbers from the closest neighbor, and separated by the local potter's field by only a stretch of meadow land, bisected by a narrow neck of the rather dense forest which lies to the north. The distance was greater than we wished, but we could get no nearer house without going on the other side of the field, wholly out of the factory district. We were not much displeased, however, since there were no people between us and our sinister source of supplies. The walk was a trifle long, but we could haul our silent specimens undisturbed. Our practice was surprisingly large from the very first, large enough to please most young doctors, and large enough to prove a bore and a burden to students whose real interest lay elsewhere. The mill hands were of somewhat turbulent inclinations, and beside their many natural needs, their frequent clashes and stabbing affrays gave us plenty to do. But what actually absorbed our minds was the secret laboratory we had fitted up in the cellar. The laboratory, with the long table under the electric lights, where in the small hours of the morning we often injected West's various solutions into the veins of the things we dragged from Potter's Field. West was experimenting madly to find something which would start a man's vital motions anew after they had been stopped by the thing we called death that had encountered the most ghastly obstacles. The solution had been differently compounded for different types. What would serve for a guinea pig would not serve for a human being, and different specimens required large modifications. The bodies had to be exceedingly fresh, or the slight decomposition of brain tissue would render the perfect reanimation impossible. Indeed, the greatest problem was to get them fresh enough. West had had horrible experiences during his secret college research with corpses of doubtful vintage. The results of partial or imperfect reanimation were much more hideous than were the total failures, and we both had fearsome recollections of such things. Ever since our first demonic session in the deserted farmhouse on Meadow Hill in Arkham, we had felt a brooding menace, and West, though a calm, blonde, blue-eyed scientific automaton in most respects, often confessed to a shuddering sensation of stealthy pursuit. He half felt that he was followed, psychological delusion of shaken nerves, enhanced by the undeniable disturbing fact that at least one of our reanimated specimens was still alive, a frightful carnivorous thing in a padded cell at Sefton. Then there was another of our first, whose exact fate we had never learned. We had fair luck with specimens in Bolton, much better than in Arkham. We had not been settled a week before we got an accident victim on the very night of burial, and made it open its eyes with an amazingly rational expression before the solution failed. It had lost an arm. If it had been a perfect body, we might have succeeded better. Between then and the next January, we secured 3 more, 1 total failure, 1 case of marked muscular motion, and 1 rather shivering thing. It rose itself and uttered a sound. Then came a period when luck was poor. Internments fell off, and those that did not occur were specimens either too diseased or too maimed for us. We kept track of all the deaths and their circumstances with systematic care. One March night, however, we unexpectedly obtained a specimen which did not come from Potter's Field. In Bolton, the prevailing spirit of Puritanism had outlawed the sport of boxing, with the usual result. Surreptitious and ill-conducted bouts among the mill workers were common, and occasionally a professional talent of low grade was imported. This late winter night there had been such a match, evidently with disastrous results. Since, 2 timorous pulls had come to us with incoherently whispered entreaties to attend to a very secret and desperate case. We followed them to an abandoned barn where the remnants of a crowd of frightened foreigners were watching a silent black form on the floor. The match had been between Kid O'Brien, a lubberly and now quaky youth with a most un-hibernarian hooked nose, and Book Robinson, the Harlem Smoke. The boy had been knocked out, and a moment's examination had showed us that he would be permanently remain so. He was a loathsome, gorilla-like, with abnormally long arms, which I could not help calling forelegs, and a face that conjured up thoughts of unspeakable secrets and poundings under an eerie moon. The body must have looked even worse in life, but the world holds many ugly things. Fear was upon the whole pitiful crowd, for they did not know what law would exact of them if the affair were not hushed up, and they were grateful when West, in spite of my involuntarily shudders, offered to rid of the thing quietly, for a purpose I know too well. There was a bright moonlight over the snowless landscape, but we dressed the thing and carried it home between us through the deserted streets and meadows, as we had carried a similar thing one horrible night in Arkham. We approached the house from the field in the rear, took the specimen in the back door and down the cellar stairs, and prepared it for the usual experiment. Our fear of the police was absurdly great, though we had timed our trip to avoid the solitary patrolman of that section. The result was wearily anticlimactic. Ghastly as our prize appeared, it was wholly unresponsive to every solution we injected in its arm. Solutions prepared from experience with other specimens only. So, as the hour grew dangerously near to dawn, we did as we had done with others, dragged the thing across the meadows to the neck of the woods near Potter's Field, and buried it there in the best sort of grave the frozen ground would furnish. The grave was not very deep, but fully as good as that of the previous specimen, the thing which had risen itself and uttered a sound. In the light of our dark lanterns, we carefully covered it with leaves and dead vines, fairly certain the police would never find it in a forest so dim and dense. The next day, I was increasingly apprehensive about the police, for a patient brought rumors of a suspected fight and death. West had still another source of worry, for he had been called in the afternoon to a case which ended very threateningly. An Italian woman had become hysterical over her missing child, a lad of 5 who had strayed off early in the morning and failed to appear for dinner, and had developed symptoms highly alarming in view of an always weak heart. It was a foolish hysteria, for the boy had often run away before, but Italian peasants were exceedingly superstitious, and this woman seemed as much harassed by omens as by facts. About 7 o'clock in the evening she had died, and her frantic husband had made a frightful scene in his efforts to kill West, whom he he wildly blamed for not saving her life. Friends had held him when he drew a stiletto, but West departed amidst his inhuman shrieks, curses, and oaths of vengeance. In his latest affliction, the fellow seemed to have forgotten his child, who was still missing as the night advanced. There was some talk of searching the woods, but most of the family's friends were busy with the dead woman and screaming man. Altogether, the nervous strain upon West must have been tremendous. Thoughts of the police and the mad man both weighed heavily. We were tired about 11, but I did not sleep well. Bolton had a surprisingly good police force for so a small town, and I could not help but fearing the mess which would ensue if the affair of the night before were ever tracked down. It might mean the end of all our local work, and perhaps prison for both West and me. I did not like these rumors of a fight which were floating about. After the clock had struck 3, the moon shone in my eyes, but I turned over without rising to pull down the shade. Then came the steady rattling at the back door. I lay still and somewhat dazed, but before long I heard West's rap on my door. He was clad in a dressing gown and slippers, and had his hands at a revolver and an electric flashlight. From the revolver, I knew that he was thinking more of the crazed person than the police. "We'd better both go," he whispered. "It wouldn't do not to answer it anyway, and it might be a patient. It would be like one of those fools to try the back door." So we both went down to the stairs on tiptoe, with a fear partly justified and partly that which comes only from the soul of the weird small hours. The rattling continued, growing somewhat louder. When we reached the door, I cautiously unbolted it and threw it open, and as the moon streamed revealingly down on the form silhouetted there, West did a peculiar thing. Despite the obvious danger of attracting notice and bringing down on our heads the dreaded police investigation, a thing which, after all, was mercifully averted by the relative isolation of our cottage, my friend suddenly, excitedly, and unnecessarily emptied all 6 chambers of his revolver into the nocturnal visitor. For that visitor was neither the angry man nor the policeman. Looming hideously against the spectral moon was a gigantic, misshapen thing not to be imagined save in nightmares. A glassy-eyed, ink-black apparition nearly on all fours, covered with bits of mold, leaves, and vines, foul with caked blood, and having between its glistening teeth a snow-white, terrible, cylindrical object terminating in a tiny hand. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like. And if you want to see and hear more from me, then hit that subscribe button. I am the voice of the old ones, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.